Section 5 of Signs of Change by William Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Deborah Brabin. The Hopes of Civilization, Part 1. Every age has had its hopes, hopes that look to something beyond the life of the age itself, hopes that try to pierce into the future. And strange to say, I believe that those hopes have been stronger not in the heyday of the epoch which has given them birth, but rather in its decadence and times of corruption. In sober truth it may well be that these hopes are but a reflection in those that live happily and comfortably of the vain longings of those others who suffer with little power of expressing their sufferings in an audible voice. When all goes well, the happy world forgets these people and their desires, sure as it is that their woes are not dangerous to them, the wealthy, whereas when the woes and grief of the poor begin to rise to a point beyond the endurance of men, fear, conscious or unconscious, falls upon the rich, and they begin to look about them to see what there may be among the elements of their society which may be used as palliatives for the misery which, long existing and ever growing greater among the slaves of that society, is now at last forcing itself on the attention of the masters. Times of change, disruption and revolution are naturally times of hope also, and not seldom the hopes of something better to come are the first tokens that tell people that revolution is at hand, though commonly such tokens are no more believed than Cassandra's prophecies, or are even taken in a contrary sense by those who have anything to lose, since they look upon them as signs of the prosperity of the times and the long endurance of that state of things which is so kind to them. Let us then see what the hopes of civilization are like today, for indeed I purpose speaking of our own times chiefly, and will leave for the present all mention of that older civilization which was destroyed by the healthy barbarism out of which our present society has grown. Yet a few words may be necessary concerning the birth of our present epoch and the hopes it gave rise to, and what has become of them. That will not take us very far back in history, as to my mind our modern civilization begins with the stirring period about the time of the Reformation in England, the time which in the then more important countries of the continent is known as the period of the Renaissance, the so-called new birth of art and learning. And first remember that this period includes the death throes of feudalism, with all the good and evil which that system bore with it. For centuries past its end was getting ready by the gradual weakening of the bonds of the great hierarchy which held men together. The characteristics of those bonds were, theoretically at least, personal rights and personal duties between superior and inferior all down the scale. Each man was born, so to say, subject to these conditions, and the mere accidents of his life could not free him from them. Commerce in our sense of the word there was none, capitalistic manufacture, capitalistic exchange was unknown. To buy goods cheap that you might sell them dear was a legal offence, forestalling. To buy goods in the market in the morning and to sell them in the afternoon in the same place was not thought a useful occupation, and was forbidden under the name of regrating. Usury, instead of leading as now directly to the highest offices of the state, was thought wrong, and the profit of it mostly fell to the chosen people of God. The robbery of the workers, thought necessary then as now to the very existence of the state, was carried out quite crudely, without any concealment or excuse, by arbitrary taxation or open violence. On the other hand, life was easy, and common necessaries plenteous. The holidays of the church were holidays in the modern sense of the word, downright play days, and there were 96 obligatory ones. Nor were the people tame and sheep-like, but as rough-handed and bold a set of good fellows as ever rubbed through life under the sun. I remember 3 passages from contemporary history or gossip about the life of those times which luck has left us, and which illustrate curiously the change that has taken place in the habits of Englishmen. A lady, writing from Norfolk 400 years ago to her husband in London, amidst various commissions for tapestries, groceries and gowns, bids him also not to forget to bring back with him a good supply of crossbows and bolts, since the windows of their hall were too low to be handy for longbow shooting. A German traveller, writing quite at the end of the medieval period, speaks of the English as the laziest and proudest people and the best cooks in Europe. A Spanish ambassador about the same period says, "These English live in houses built of sticks and mud, but therein they fare as plenteously as lords." Indeed, I confess that it is with a strange emotion that I recall these times, and try to realize the life of our forefathers, men who were named like ourselves, spoke nearly the same tongue, lived on the same spots of earth, and therewithal were as different from us in manners, habits, ways of life and thought, as though they lived in another planet. The very face of the country has changed. Not merely, I mean, in London and the great manufacturing centres. but through the country generally. There is no piece of English ground, except such places as Salisbury Plain, but bears witness to the amazing change which 400 years has brought upon us. Not seldom I please myself with trying to realize the face of medieval England, the many chases and great woods, the stretches of common tillage and common pasture quite unenclosed, the rough husbandry of the tilled parts, the unimproved breeds of cattle, sheep and swine, especially the latter, so lank and long and lathy, looking so strange to us, the strings of pack-horses along the bridle roads, the scantiness of the wheel roads, scarce any except those left by the Romans and those made from monastery to monastery, the scarcity of bridges, and people using ferries instead, or fords where they could, the little towns, well bechurched, often walled, the villages just where they are now, except for those that have nothing but the church left to tell of them, but bigger and more populous. Their churches, some big and handsome, some small and curious, but all crowded with altars and furniture, and gay with pictures and ornament. The many religious houses with their glorious architecture. The beautiful manor houses, some of them castles once, and survivals from an earlier period, some new and elegant, some out of all proportion small for the importance of their lords. How strange it would be to us if we could be landed in 14th century England! Unless we saw the crest of some familiar hill, like that which yet bears upon it a symbol of an English tribe, and from which, looking down on the plain where Alfred was born, I once had many such ponderings, we should not know into what country of the world we were come. The name is left, scarce a thing else. And when I think of this, it quickens my hope of what may be. Even so it will be with us in time to come. All will have changed, and another people will be dwelling here in England who, although they may be of our blood and bear our name, will wonder how we lived in the 19th century. Well, under all that rigidly ordered caste society of the 14th century, with its rough plenty, its sauntering life, its cool acceptance of rudeness and violence, there was going on a keen struggle of classes, which carried with it the hope of progress of those days. The serfs gradually getting freed and becoming some of them the town population, the first journeymen or free labourers so-called, some of them the copyholders of agricultural land. The corporations of the towns gathered power. The craft guilds grew into perfection and corruption. The power of the crown increased, attended with nascent bureaucracy. In short, the middle class was forming underneath the outward show of feudalism still intact. And all was getting ready for the beginning of the great commercial epoch, in whose latter days I would fain hope we are living. That epoch began with the portentous change of agriculture, which meant cultivating for profit instead of for livelihood, and which carried with it the expropriation of the people from the land, the extinction of the yeoman, and the rise of the capitalist farmer, and the growth of the town population, which, swelled by the drift of the landless vagabonds and masterless men, grew into a definite proletariat or class of free workmen. And their existence made that of the embryo capitalist manufacturer also possible, and the reign of commercial contract and cash payment began to take the place of the old feudal hierarchy, with its many-linked chain of personal responsibilities. The latter half of the 17th century, the reign of Charles II, saw the last blow struck at this feudal system, when the landowner's military service was abolished, and they simply became owners of property that had no duties attached to it save the payment of a land tax. The hopes of the early part of the commercial period may be read in almost every book of the time, expressed in various degrees of dull or amusing pedantry, and show a naïf arrogance and contempt of the times just past, which nothing but the utmost simplicity of ignorance could have attained to. But the times were stirring and gave birth to the most powerful individualities in many branches of literature, and more in Campanella at least, from the midst of the exuberant triumph of young commercialism, gave to the world prophetic hopes of times yet to come, when that commercialism itself should have given place to the society which we hope will be the next transform of civilization into something else, into a new social life. This period of early and exuberant hopes passed into the next stage of sober realization of many of them, for commerce grew and moulded all society to its needs. The workman of the 16th century worked still as an individual with little cooperation and scarce any division of labour. By the end of the 17th he had become only a part of a group, which by that time was in the handicrafts the real unit of production. Division of labour even at that period had quite destroyed his individuality, and the worker was but part of a machine. All through the 18th century this system went on progressing towards perfection, till to most men of that period, to most of those who were in any way capable of expressing their thoughts, civilization had already reached a high stage of perfection and was certain to go on from better to better. These hopes were not on the surface of a very revolutionary kind, but nevertheless the class struggle still went on, and quite openly too. For the remains of feudality, aided by the mere mask and grimace of the religion which was once a real part of the feudal system, hampered the progress of commerce sorely, and seemed a thousandfold more powerful than it really was, because in spite of the class struggle, there was really a covert alliance between the powerful middle classes who were the children of commerce and their old masters, the aristocracy. An unconscious understanding between them, rather, in the midst of their contest, that certain matters were to be respected even by the advanced party. The contest and civil war between the king and the commons in England in the 17th century illustrates this well. The caution with which privilege was attacked in the beginning of the struggle, the unwillingness of all the leaders save a few enthusiasts to carry matters to their logical consequences, even when the march of events had developed the antagonism between aristocratic privilege and middle-class freedom of contract, so-called. Finally, the crystallization of the new order conquered by the sword of Naseby into a mongrel condition of things between privilege and bourgeois freedom, the defeat and grief of the purist republicans, and the horror at and swift extinction of the levellers, the pioneers of socialism in that day, all point to the fact that the party of progress, as we should call it now, was determined after all that privilege should not be abolished further than its own standpoint. The 17th century ended in the Great Whig Revolution in England, and as I said, commerce throve and grew enormously, and the power of the middle classes increased proportionately, and all seemed going smoothly with them. Till at last in France, the culminating corruption of a society still nominally existing for the benefit of the privileged aristocracy forced their hand. The old order of things, backed as it was by the power of the executive, by that semblance of overwhelming physical force which is the real and only cement of a society founded on the slavery of the many, the aristocratic power seemed strong and inexpugnable. And since any stick will do to beat a dog with, the middle classes in France were forced to take up the first stick that lay ready to hand if they were not to give way to the aristocrats, which indeed the whole evolution of history forbade them to do. Therefore, as in England in the 17th century the middle classes allied themselves to religious and republican and even communistic enthusiasts, with the intention, firm though unexpressed, to keep them down when they had mounted to power by their means, so in France they had to ally themselves with the proletariat, which, shamefully oppressed and degraded as it had been, now for the first time in history began to feel its power, the power of numbers. By means of this help they triumphed over aristocratic privilege, but on the other hand, although the proletariat was speedily reduced again to a position not much better than that it had held before the revolution, the part it played therein gave a new and terrible character to that revolution. And from that time forward the class struggle entered on to a new phase. The middle classes had gained a complete victory, which in France carried with it all the outward signs of victory, though in England they chose to consider a certain part of themselves an aristocracy, who had indeed little signs of aristocracy about them either for good or for evil, being in very few cases of long descent, and being in their manners and ideas unmistakably bourgeois. So was accomplished the second act of the great class struggle with whose first act began the aid of commerce. As to the hopes of this period of the Revolution, we all know how extravagant they were. What a complete regeneration of the world was expected to result from the abolition of the grossest forms of privilege, and I must say that before we mock at the extravagance of those hopes, we should try to put ourselves in the place of those that held them, and try to conceive how the privilege of the old noblesse must have galled the respectable well-to-do people of that time. Well, the reasonable part of those hopes were realized by the Revolution. In other words, it accomplished what it really aimed at, the freeing of commerce from the fetters of sham feudality, or, in other words, the destruction of aristocratic privilege. The more extravagant part of the hopes expressed by the 18th century revolution were vague enough, and tended in the direction of supposing that the working classes would be benefited by what was to the interest of the middle class, in some way quite unexplained, by a kind of magic, one may say, which welfare of the workers, as it was never directly aimed at but only hoped for by the way, so also did not come about by any such magical means, and the triumphant middle classes began gradually to find themselves looked upon no longer as rebellious servants, but as oppressive masters. The middle class had freed commerce from her fetters of privilege, and had freed thought from her fetters of theology, at least partially, but it had not freed nor attempted to free labour from its fetters. The leaders of the French Revolution, even amidst the fears, suspicions and slaughter of the terror, upheld the rights of property, so-called. Though a new pioneer or prophet appeared in France, analogous in some respects to the levellers of Cromwell's time, but as might be expected far more advanced and reasonable than they were. Gracchus Babeuf and his fellows were treated as criminals, and died or suffered the torture of prison for attempting to put into practice those words which the Republic still carried on its banners. And liberty, fraternity and equality were interpreted in a middle class, or, if you please, a Jesuitical sense, as the rewards of success for those who could struggle into an exclusive class. And at last property had to be defended by a military adventurer, and the revolution seemed to have ended with Napoleonism. Nevertheless, the revolution was not dead, nor was it possible to say, thus far and no further to the rising tide. Commerce, which had created the propertyless proletariat throughout civilization, had still another part to play which is not yet played out. She had and has to teach the workers to know what they are, to educate them, to consolidate them, and not only to give them aspirations for their advancement as a class, but to make means for them to realize those aspirations. All this she did, nor loitered in her work either. From the beginning of the 19th century, the history of civilization is really the history of the last of the class struggles which was inaugurated by the French Revolution. And England, who all through the times of the Revolution and the Caesarism which followed it appeared to be the steady foe of revolution, was really as steadily furthering it. Her natural conditions, her store of coals and minerals, her temperate climate, extensive seaboard and many harbours, and lastly her position as the outpost of Europe looking into America across the ocean, doomed her to be, for a time at least, the mistress of the commerce of the civilized world, and its agent with barbarous and semi-barbarous countries. The necessities of this destiny drove her into the implacable war with France, a war which, nominally waged on behalf of monarchical principles, was really, though doubtless unconsciously, carried on for the possession of the foreign and colonial markets. She came out victorious from that war, and fully prepared to take advantage of the Industrial Revolution which had been going on the while, and which I now ask you to note. I have said that the 18th century perfected the system of labour which took the place of the medieval system, under which a workman individually carried his piece of work all through its various stages from the first to the last. This new system, the first change in industrial production since the Middle Ages, is known as the system of division of labour, wherein, as I said, the unit of labour is a group, not a man. The individual workman in this system is kept lifelong at the performance of some task quite petty in itself, and which he soon masters, and having mastered it has nothing more to do but to go on increasing his speed of hand, under the spur of competition with his fellows, until he has become the perfect machine which it is his ultimate duty to become, since without attaining to that end he must die or become a pauper. You can well imagine how this glorious invention of division of labour, this complete destruction of individuality in the workman, and his apparent hopeless enslavement to his profit-grinding master, stimulated the hopes of civilization. Probably more hymns have been sung in praise of division of labour, more sermons preached about it, than have done homage to the precept, "Do unto others as ye would they should do unto you." To drop all irony, surely this was one of those stages of civilization at which one might well say that, if it was to stop there, it was a pity that it had ever got so far. I have had to study books and methods of work of the 18th century a good deal, French chiefly, and I must say that the impression made on me by that study is that the 18th century artisan must have been a terrible product of civilization, and quite in a condition to give rise to hopes of the torch, the pike, and the guillotine. End of section 5. Section 6 of Signs of Change by William Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Deborah Brabin. The Hopes of Civilization, Part 2. However, civilization was not going to stop there. Having turned the man into a machine, the next stage for commerce to aim at was to contrive machines which would widely dispense with human labour. Nor was this aim altogether disappointed. Now at first sight it would seem that, having got the workman into such a plight as he was, as the slave of division of labour, this new invention of machines, which should free him from a part of his labour at least, could be nothing to him but an unmixed blessing. Doubtless it will prove to have been so in the end, when certain institutions have been swept away which most people now look on as eternal. But a longish time has passed during which the workman's hopes of civilization have been disappointed. For those who invented the machines, or rather who profited by their invention, did not aim at the saving of labour in the sense of reducing the labour which each man had to do, but, first taking it for granted that every workman would have to work as long as he could stand up to it, aimed under those conditions of labour at producing the utmost possible amount of goods which they could sell at a profit. Need I dwell on the fact that, under these circumstances, the invention of the machines has benefited the workman but little, even to this day. Nay, at first they made his position worse than it had been. For being thrust on the world very suddenly, they distinctly brought about an industrial revolution, changing everything suddenly and completely. Industrial productiveness was increased prodigiously, but so far from the workers reaping the benefit of this, they were thrown out of work in enormous numbers, while those who were still employed were reduced from the position of skilled artisans to that of unskilled labourers. The aims of their masters being, as I said, to make a profit, they did not trouble themselves about this as a class, but took it for granted that it was something that couldn't be helped and didn't hurt them. Nor did they think of offering to the workers that compensation for harassed interests which they have since made a point of claiming so loudly for themselves. This was the state of things which followed on the conclusion of European peace, and even that peace itself rather made matters worse than better, by the sudden cessation of all war industries and the throwing onto the market many thousands of soldiers and sailors. In short, at no period of English history was the condition of the workers worse than in the early years of the 19th century. There seemed during this period to have been two currents of hope that had reference to the working classes. The first affected the masters, the second the men. In England, and in what I am saying of this period I am chiefly thinking of England, the hopes of the richer classes ran high, and no wonder. For England had by this time become the mistress of the markets of the world, and also, as the people of that period were never weary of boasting, the workshop of the world. The increase in the riches of the country was enormous, even at the early period I am thinking of now, prior to 48 I mean, though it increased much more speedily in times that we have all seen. But part of the jubilant hopes of this newly rich man concerned his servants, the instruments of his fortune. It was hoped that the population in general would grow wiser, better educated, thriftier, more industrious, more comfortable. For which hope there was surely some foundation, since man's mastery over the forces of nature was growing yearly towards completion. But you see, these benevolent gentlemen supposed that these hopes would be realized, perhaps by some unexplained magic as aforesaid, or perhaps by the working classes, at their own expense, by the exercise of virtues supposed to be specially suited to their condition and called by their masters thrift and industry. For this latter supposition there was no foundation. Indeed, the poor wretches who were thrown out of work by the triumphant march of commerce had perforce worn thrift threadbare, and could hardly better their exploits in that direction. While as to those who worked in the factories or who formed the fringe of labour elsewhere, industry was no new gospel to them, since they already worked as long as they could work without dying at the loom, the spindle, or the stithy. They for their part had their hopes, vague enough as to their ultimate aim, but expressed in the passing day by a very obvious tendency to revolt. This tendency took various forms, which I cannot dwell on here, but settled down at last into Chartism, about which I must speak a few words. But first I must mention, I can scarce do more, the honoured name of Robert Owen, as representative of the nobler hopes of his day, just as More was of his, and the lifter of the torch of socialism, amidst the dark days of the confusion consequent on the reckless greed of the early period of the great factory industries. That the conditions under which man lived could affect his life and his deeds infinitely, that not selfish greed and ceaseless contention, but brotherhood and co-operation were the bases of true society, was the gospel which he preached and also practised, with a single-heartedness, devotion, and fervour of hope which have never been surpassed. He was the embodied hope of the days when the advance of knowledge and the sufferings of the people thrust revolutionary hope upon those thinkers who were not in some form or other in the pay of the sordid masters of society. As to the Chartist agitation, there is this to be said of it, that it was thoroughly a working-class movement, and it was caused by the simplest and most powerful of all causes, hunger. It is noteworthy that it was strongest, especially in its earlier days, in the northern and midland manufacturing districts. That is, in the places which felt the distress caused by the Industrial Revolution most sorely and directly. It sprang up with particular vigour in the years immediately following the Great Reform Bill, and it has been remarked that disappointment of the hopes which that measure had cherished had something to do with its bitterness. As it went on, obvious causes for failure were developed in it. Self-seeking leadership, futile discussion of the means of making the change before organisation of the party was perfected, blind fear of ultimate consequences on the part of some, blind disregard to immediate consequences on the part of others. These were the surface reasons for its failure. But it would have triumphed over all these and accomplished revolution in England if it had not been for causes deeper and more vital than these. Chartism differed from mere radicalism in being a class movement, but its aim was, after all, political rather than social. The socialism of Robert Owen fell short of its object, because it did not understand that, as long as there is a privileged class in possession of the executive power, they will take good care that their economical position, which enables them to live on the unpaid labour of the people, is not tampered with. The hopes of the Chartists were disappointed because they did not understand that true political freedom is impossible to people who are economically enslaved. There is no first and second in these matters, the two must go hand in hand together. We cannot live as we will, and as we should, as long as we allow people to govern us whose interest it is that we should live as they will, and by no means as we should. Neither is it any use claiming the right to manage our own business unless we are prepared to have some business of our own. These two aims united mean the furthering of the class struggle till all classes are abolished. The divorce of one from the other is fatal to any hope of social advancement. Chartism, therefore, though a genuine popular movement, was incomplete in its aims and knowledge. The time was not yet come, and it could not triumph openly. But it would be a mistake to say that it failed utterly. At least it kept alive the holy flame of discontent. It made it possible for us to attain to the political goal of democracy, and thereby to advance the cause of the people by the gain of a stage from whence could be seen the fresh gain to be aimed at. I have said that the time for revolution had not then come. The great wave of commercial success went on swelling, and though the capitalists would, if they had dared, have engrossed the whole of the advantages thereby gained at the expense of their wage slaves, the Chartist revolt warned them that it was not safe to attempt it. They were forced to try to allay discontent by palliative measures. They had to allow factory acts to be passed regulating the hours and conditions of labour of women and children, and consequently of men also in some of the more important and consolidated industries. They were forced to repeal the ferocious laws against combination among the workmen, so that the trades unions won for themselves a legal position and became a power in the labour question, and were able, by means of strikes and threats of strikes, to regulate the wages granted to the workers, and to raise the standard of livelihood for a certain part of the skilled workmen and the labourers associated with them, though the main part of the unskilled, including the agricultural workmen, were no better off than before. Thus was damped down the flame of a discontent vague in its aims and passionately crying out for what, if granted, it could not have used. 20 years ago, anyone hinting at the possibility of serious class discontent in this country would have been looked upon as a madman. In fact, the well-to-do and cultivated were quite unconscious, as many still are, that there was any class distinction in this country, other than what was made by the rags and cast clothes of feudalism, which in a perfunctory manner they still attacked. There was no sign of revolutionary feeling in England 20 years ago. The middle class was so rich that they had no need to hope for anything but a heaven which they did not believe in. The well-to-do working men did not hope, since they were not pinched and had no means of learning their degraded position. And lastly, the drudges of the proletariat had such hope as charity, the hospital, the workhouse, and kind death at last could offer them. In this stock-jobber's heaven let us leave our dear countrymen for a little, while I say a few words about the affairs of the people on the continent of Europe. Things were not quite so smooth for the fleecer there. Socialist thinkers and writers had arisen, about the same time as Robert Owen. Saint-Simon, Proudhon, Fourier and his followers kept up the traditions of hope in the midst of a bourgeois world. Amongst these, Fourier is the one that calls for most attention, since his doctrine of the necessity and possibility of making labour attractive is one which socialism can by no means do without. France also kept up the revolutionary and insurrectionary tradition, the result of something like hope still fermenting amongst the proletariat. She fell at last into the clutches of a second Caesarism, developed by the basest set of sharpest swindlers and harlots that ever insulted a country, and of whom our own happy bourgeois at home made heroes and heroines, the hideous open corruption of Parisian society to which, I repeat, our respectable classes accorded heartfelt sympathy, was finally swept away by the horrors of a race war. The defeats and disgraces of this war developed on the one hand an increase in the wooden implacability and baseness of the French bourgeois, but on the other made way for revolutionary hope to spring again, from which resulted the attempt to establish society on the basis of the freedom of labour, which we call the Commune of Paris of 1871. Whatever mistakes or imprudences were made in this attempt, and all wars blossom thick with such mistakes, I will leave the reactionary enemies of the people's cause to put forward. The immediate and obvious result was the slaughter of thousands of brave and honest revolutionists at the hands of the respectable classes, the loss, in fact, of an army for the popular cause. But we may be sure that the results of the Commune will not stop there. To all socialists, that heroic attempt will give hope and ardour in the cause as long as it is to be won. We feel as though the Paris workmen had striven to bring the day-dawn for us, and had lifted us the sun's rim over the horizon, never to set in utter darkness again. Of such attempts one must say that, though those who perished in them might have been put in a better place in the battle, yet after all brave men never die for nothing when they die for principle. Let us shift from France to Germany before we get back to England again, and conclude with a few words about our hopes at the present day. To Germany we owe the school of economists at whose head stands the name of Karl Marx, who have made modern socialism what it is. The earlier socialist writers and preachers based their hopes on man being taught to see the desirableness of cooperation taking the place of competition, and adopting the change voluntarily and consciously. And they trusted to schemes more or less artificial being tried and accepted, although such schemes were necessarily constructed out of the materials which capitalistic society offered. But the new school, starting with an historical view of what had been, and seeing that a law of evolution swayed all events in it, was able to point out to us that the evolution was still going on, and that whether socialism be desirable or not, it is at least inevitable. Here, then, was at last a hope of a different kind to any that had gone before it, and the German and Austrian workmen were not slow to learn the lesson founded on this theory. From being one of the most backward countries in Europe in the movement before Lassalle started his German Workmen's Party in 1863, Germany soon became the leader in it. Bismarck's repressive law has only acted on opinion there as the roller does to the growing grass, made it firmer and stronger. And whatever vicissitudes may be the fate of the party as a party, there can be no doubt that socialistic opinion is firmly established there, and that when the time is ripe for it, that opinion will express itself in action. Now, in all I have been saying, I have been wanting you to trace the fact that, ever since the establishment of commercialism on the ruins of feudality, there has been growing a steady feeling on the part of the workers that they are a class dealt with as a class, and in like manner to deal with others. And that as this class feeling has grown, so also has grown with it a consciousness of the antagonism between their class and the class which employs it, as the phrase goes, that is to say, which lives by means of its labour. Now it is just this growing consciousness of the fact that, as long as there exists in society a propertied class living on the labour of a propertyless one, there must be a struggle always going on between those two classes. It is just the dawning knowledge of this fact which should show us what civilization can hope for, namely, transformation into true society, in which there will no longer be classes with their necessary struggle for existence and superiority. For the antagonism of classes which began in all simplicity between the master and the chattel-slave of ancient society, and was continued between the feudal lord and the serf of medieval society, has gradually become the contention between the capitalist developed from the workman of the last named period and the wage earner. In the former struggle, the rise of the artisan and village tenant created a new class, the middle class, while the place of the old serf was filled by the propertyless labourer, with whom the middle class, which has absorbed the aristocracy, is now face to face. The struggle between the classes, therefore, is once again a simple one, as in the days of the classical peoples. But since there is no longer any strong race left out of civilization, as in the time of the disruption of Rome, the whole struggle in all its simplicity between those who have and those who lack is within civilization. Moreover, the capitalist or modern slave owner has been forced by his very success, as we have seen, to organize his slaves, the wage earners, into cooperation for production so well arranged that it requires little but his own elimination to make it a foundation for communal life. In the teeth also of the experience of past ages, he has been compelled to allow a modicum of education to the propertyless, and has not even been able to deprive them wholly of political rights. His own advance in wealth and power has bred for him the very enemy who is doomed to make an end of him. But will there be any new class to take the place of the present proletariat when that has triumphed, as it must do, over the present privileged class? We cannot foresee the future, but we may fairly hope not. At least we cannot see any signs of such a new class forming. It is impossible to see how destruction of privilege can stop short of absolute equality of condition. Pure communism is the logical deduction from the imperfect form of the new society, which is generally differentiated from it as socialism. Meantime, it is this simplicity and directness of the growing contest which above all things presents itself as a terror to the conservative instinct of the present day. Many among the middle class, who are sincerely grieved and shocked at the condition of the proletariat which civilization has created, and even alarmed by the frightful inequalities which it fosters, do nevertheless shudder back from the idea of the class struggle and strive to shut their eyes to the fact that it is going on. They try to think that peace is not only possible but natural between the two classes, the very essence of whose existence is that each can only thrive by what it manages to force the other to yield to it. They propose to themselves the impossible problem of raising the inferior or exploited classes into a position in which they will cease to struggle against the superior classes, while the latter will not cease to exploit them. This absurd position drives them into the concoction of schemes for bettering the condition of the working classes at their own expense, some of them futile, some merely fantastic. Or they may be divided again into those which point out the advantages and pleasures of involuntary asceticism, and reactionary plans for importing the conditions of the production and life of the Middle Ages, wholly misunderstood by them, by the way, into the present system of the capitalist farmer, the great industries, and the universal world market. Some see a solution of the social problem in sham cooperation, which is merely an improved form of joint stockery. Others preach thrift, to precarious incomes of 18 shillings a week, and industry to men killing themselves by inches in working overtime, or to men whom the labour market has rejected as not wanted. Others beg the proletarians not to breed so fast, an injunction the compliance with which might at first be of advantage to the proletarians themselves in their present condition, but would certainly undo the capitalists if it were carried to any lengths, and would lead through ruin and misery to the violent outbreak of the very revolution which these timid people are so anxious to forego. Then there are others who, looking back on the past, and perceiving that the workmen of the Middle Ages lived in more comfort and self-respect than ours do, even though they were subjected to the class rule of men who were looked on as another order of beings than they, think that if those conditions of life could be reproduced under our better political conditions, the question would be solved, for a time at least. Their schemes may be summed up in attempts, more or less preposterously futile, to graft a class of independent peasants on our system of wages and capital. They do not understand that this system of independent workmen, producing almost entirely for the consumption of themselves and their neighbours, and exploited by the upper classes by obvious taxes on their labour, which was not otherwise organised or interfered with by the exploiters, was what in the past times took the place of our system, in which the workers sell their labour in the competitive market to masters who have in their hands the whole organisation of the markets, and that these two systems are mutually destructive. Others again believe in the possibility of starting from our present workhouse system for the raising of the lowest part of the working population into a better condition, but do not trouble themselves as to the position of the workers who are fairly above the condition of pauperism, or consider what part they will play in the contest for a better livelihood. And lastly, quite a large number of well-intentioned persons belonging to the richer classes believe that in a society that compels competition for livelihood, and holds out to the workers as a stimulus to exertion the hope of their rising into a monopolist class of non-producers, it is yet possible to moralize capital, to use a slang phrase of the positivists. That is to say, that a sentiment imported from a religion which looks upon another world as the true sphere of action for mankind will override the necessities of our daily life in this world. This curious hope is founded on the feeling that a sentiment antagonistic to the full development of commercialism exists and is gaining ground, and that this sentiment is an independent growth of the ethics of the present epoch. As a matter of fact, admitting its existence as I think we must do, it is the birth of the sense of insecurity which is the shadow cast before by the approaching dissolution of modern society founded on wage slavery. The greater part of these schemes aim, though seldom with the consciousness of their promoters, at the creation of a new middle class out of the wage-earning class and at their expense, just as the present middle class was developed out of the serf population of the early Middle Ages. It may be possible that such a further development of the middle class lies before us, but it will not be brought about by any such artificial means as the above-mentioned schemes. If it comes at all, it must be produced by events which at present we cannot foresee, acting on our commercial system, and revivifying for a little time, maybe, that capitalist society which now seems sickening towards its end. For what is visible before us in these days is the competitive commercial system killing itself by its own force. Profits lessening, businesses growing bigger and bigger, the small employer of labour thrust out of his function, and the aggregation of capital, increasing the numbers of the lower middle class from above rather than from below, by driving the smaller manufacturer into the position of a mere servant to the bigger. The productivity of labour also increasing out of all proportion to the capacity of the capitalists to manage the market or deal with the labour supply. Lack of employment, therefore, becoming chronic, and discontent therewithal. All this on the one hand. On the other, the workmen claiming everywhere political equality, which cannot long be denied, and education spreading, so that what between the improvement in the education of the working class and the continued amazing fatuity of that of the upper classes, there is a distinct tendency to equalization here. And as I have hinted above, all history shows us what a danger to society may be a class at once educated and socially degraded. Though indeed no history has shown us what is swiftly advancing upon us, a class which, though it shall have attained knowledge, shall lack utterly the refinement and self-respect which come from the union of knowledge with leisure and ease of life. The growth of such a class may well make the cultured people of today tremble. Whatever, therefore, of unforeseen and unconceived of may lie in the womb of the future, there is nothing visible before us but a decaying system, with no outlook but ever-increasing entanglement and blindness, and a new system, socialism, the hope of which is ever growing clearer in men's minds. A system which not only sees how labour can be freed from its present fetters, and organised unwastefully so as to produce the greatest possible amount of wealth for the community and for every member of it, but which bears with it its own ethics and religion and aesthetics, that is, the hope and promise of a new and higher life in all ways. So that even if those unforeseen economical events above spoken of were to happen, and put off for a while the end of our capitalist system, the latter would drag itself along as an anomaly cursed by all, a mere clog on the aspirations of humanity. It is not likely that it will come to that. In all probability, the logical outcome of the latter days of capitalism will go step by step with its actual history. While all men, even its declared enemies, will be working to bring socialism about, the aims of those who have learned to believe in the certainty and beneficence of its advent will become clearer, their methods for realizing it clearer also, and at last ready to hand. Then will come that open acknowledgement for the necessity of the change, an acknowledgement coming from the intelligence of civilization, which is commonly called revolution. It is no use prophesying as to the events which will accompany that revolution, but to a reasonable man it seems unlikely to the last degree, or we will say impossible, that a moral sentiment will induce the proprietary classes, those who live by owning the means of production which the unprivileged classes must needs use, to yield up this privilege uncompelled. All one can hope is that they will see the implicit threat of compulsion in the events of the day, and so yield with a good grace to the terrible necessity of forming a part of the world in which all, including themselves, will work honestly and live easily. End of section 6. Section 7 of Signs of Change by William Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Deborah Brabin. The Aims of Art. In considering the aims of art, that is, why men toilsomely cherish and practice art, I find myself compelled to generalize from the only specimen of humanity of which I know anything, to wit, myself. Now, when I think of what it is that I desire, I find that I can give it no other name than happiness. I want to be happy while I live. For as for death, I find that, never having experienced it, I have no conception of what it means, and so cannot even bring my mind to bear upon it. I know what it is to live. I cannot even guess what it is to be dead. Well then, I want to be happy, and even sometimes, say generally, to be merry, and I find it difficult to believe that that is not the universal desire, so that whatever tends towards that end I cherish with all my best endeavour. Now when I consider my life further, I find out, or seem to, that it is under the influence of two dominating moods, which for lack of better words I must call the mood of energy and the mood of idleness. These two moods are, now one, now the other, always crying out in me to be satisfied. When the mood of energy is upon me, I must be doing something, or I become mopish and unhappy. When the mood of idleness is on me, I find it hard indeed if I cannot rest and let my mind wander over the various pictures, pleasant or terrible, which my own experience or my communing with the thoughts of other men, dead or alive, have fashioned in it. And if circumstances will not allow me to cultivate this mood of idleness, I find I must at the best pass through a period of pain, till I can manage to stimulate my mood of energy to take its place and make me happy again. And if I have no means wherewith to rouse up that mood of energy to do its duty in making me happy, and I have to toil while the idle mood is upon me, then I am unhappy indeed, and almost wish myself dead, though I do not know what that means. Furthermore, I find that while in the mood of idleness memory amuses me, in the mood of energy hope cheers me, which hope is sometimes big and serious, and sometimes trivial, but that without it there is no happy energy. Again, I find that while I can sometimes satisfy this mood by merely exercising it in work that has no result beyond the passing hour, in play, in short, yet that it presently wearies of that and gets languid, the hope therein being too trivial, and sometimes even scarcely real, and that on the whole, to satisfy my master the mood, I must either be making something or making believe to make it. Well, I believe that all men's lives are compounded of these two moods in various proportions, and that this explains why they have always, with more or less of toil, cherished and practised art. Why should they have touched it else, and so added to the labour which they could not choose but do in order to live? It must have been done for their pleasure, since it has only been in very elaborate civilizations that a man could get other men to keep him alive merely to produce works of art, whereas all men that have left any signs of their existence behind them have practised art. I suppose, indeed, that nobody will be inclined to deny that the end proposed by a work of art is always to please the person whose senses are to be made conscious of it. It was done for someone who was to be made happier by it. His idle or restful mood was to be amused by it, so that the vacancy which is the besetting evil of that mood might give place to pleased contemplation, dreaming, or what you will. And by this means he would not so soon be driven into his workful or energetic mood. He would have more enjoyment, and better. The restraining of restlessness, therefore, is clearly one of the essential aims of art, and few things could add to the pleasure of life more than this. There are, to my knowledge, gifted people now alive who have no other vice than this of restlessness, and seemingly no other curse in their lives to make them unhappy, but that is enough. It is the little rift within the lute. Restlessness makes them hapless men and bad citizens. But granting, as I suppose you all will do, that this is a most important function for art to fulfill, the question next comes, at what price do we obtain it? I have admitted that the practice of art has added to the labour of mankind, though I believe in the long run it will not do so. But in adding to the labour of man, has it added so far to his pain? There have always been people who would at once say yes to that question, so that there have been and are two sets of people who dislike and contemn art as an embarrassing folly. Besides the pious ascetics who look upon it as a worldly entanglement, which prevents men from keeping their minds fixed on the chances of their individual happiness or misery in the next world, who in short hate art because they think that it adds to man's earthly happiness. Besides these, there are also people who, looking on the struggle of life from the most reasonable point that they know of, contemn the arts because they think that they add to man's slavery by increasing the sum of his painful labour. If this were the case, it would still to my mind be a question whether it might not be worth the while to endure the extra pain of labour for the sake of the extra pleasure added to rest, assuming for the present equality of condition among men. But it seems to me that it is not the case that the practice of art adds to painful labour. Nay more, I believe that if it did, art would never have arisen at all, would certainly not be discernible as it is among peoples in whom only the germs of civilization exist. In other words, I believe that art cannot be the result of external compulsion. The labour which goes to produce it is voluntary, and partly undertaken for the sake of the labour itself, partly for the sake of the hope of producing something which, when done, shall give pleasure to the user of it. Or again, this extra labour, when it is extra, is undertaken with the aim of satisfying that mood of energy by employing it to produce something worth doing, and which therefore will keep before the worker a lively hope while he is working, and also by giving it work to do in which there is absolute immediate pleasure. Perhaps it is difficult to explain to the non-artistic capacity that this definite sensuous pleasure is always present in the handiwork of the deft workman when he is working successfully, and that it increases in proportion to the freedom and individuality of the work. Also, you must understand that this production of art, and consequent pleasure in work, is not confined to the production of matters which are works of art only, like pictures, statues, and so forth, but has been and should be a part of all labour in some form or other. So only will the claims of the mood of energy be satisfied. Therefore the aim of art is to increase the happiness of men, by giving them beauty and interest of incident to amuse their leisure, and prevent them wearying even of rest, and by giving them hope and bodily pleasure in their work, or, shortly, to make man's work happy and his rest fruitful. Consequently, genuine art is an unmixed blessing to the race of man. But as the word genuine is a large qualification, I must ask leave to attempt to draw some practical conclusions from this assertion of the aims of art, which will, I suppose, or indeed hope, lead us into some controversy on the subject. Because it is futile indeed to expect anyone to speak about art, except in the most superficial way, without encountering those social problems which all serious men are thinking of. Since art is and must be, either in its abundance or its barrenness, in its sincerity or its hollowness, the expression of the society amongst which it exists. First, then, it is clear to me that, at the present time, those who look widest at things and deepest into them are quite dissatisfied with the present state of the arts, as they are also with the present condition of society. This, I say, in the teeth of the supposed revivification of art which has taken place of late years. In fact, that very excitement about the arts amongst a part of the cultivated people of today does but show on how firm a basis the dissatisfaction above mentioned rests. 40 years ago there was much less talk about art, much less practice of it than there is now. And that is especially true of the architectural arts, which I shall mostly have to speak about now. People have consciously striven to raise the dead in art since that time, and with some superficial success. Nevertheless, in spite of this conscious effort, I must tell you that England, to a person who can feel and understand beauty, was a less grievous place to live in then than it is now. And we who feel what art means know well, though we do not often dare to say so, that 40 years hence it will be a more grievous place to us than it is now if we still follow up the road we are on. Less than 40 years ago, about 30, I first saw the city of Rouen, then still in its outward aspect a piece of the Middle Ages. No words can tell you how its mingled beauty, history, and romance took hold on me. I can only say that, looking back on my past life, I find it was the greatest pleasure I have ever had. And now it is a pleasure which no one can ever have again. It is lost to the world forever. At that time I was an undergraduate of Oxford. Though not so astounding, so romantic, or at first sight so medieval as the Norman city, Oxford in those days still kept a great deal of its earlier loveliness, and the memory of its grey streets as they then were has been an abiding influence and pleasure in my life, and would be greater still if I could only forget what they are now. A matter of far more importance than the so-called learning of the place could have been to me in any case, but which as it was, no one tried to teach me, and I did not try to learn. Since then, the guardians of this beauty and romance so fertile of education, though professedly engaged in the higher education, as the futile system of compromises which they follow is nicknamed, have ignored it utterly, have made its preservation give way to the pressure of commercial exigencies, and are determined, apparently, to destroy it altogether. There is another pleasure for the world gone down the wind. Here again the beauty and romance have been uselessly, causelessly, most foolishly thrown away. These two cases are given simply because they have been fixed in my mind. They are but types of what is going on everywhere throughout civilization. The world is everywhere growing uglier and more commonplace. In spite of the conscious and very strenuous efforts of a small group of people towards the revival of art, which are so obviously out of joint with the tendency of the age that, while the uncultivated have not even heard of them, the mass of the cultivated look upon them as a joke, and even that they are now beginning to get tired of. Now, if it be true, as I have asserted, that genuine art is an unmixed blessing to the world, this is a serious matter. For at first sight it seems to show that there will soon be no art at all in the world, which will thus lose an unmixed blessing. It can ill afford to do that, I think. For art, if it has to die, has worn itself out, and its aim will be a thing forgotten. And its aim was to make work happy and rest fruitful. Is all work to be unhappy, all rest unfruitful, then? Indeed, if art is to perish, that will be the case, unless something is to take its place. Something at present unnamed, undreamed of. I do not think that anything will take the place of art. Not that I doubt the ingenuity of man, which seems to be boundless in the direction of making himself unhappy, but because I believe the springs of art in the human mind to be deathless. And also because it seems to me easy to see the causes of the present obliteration of the arts. For we civilized people have not given them up consciously or of our free will. We have been forced to give them up. Perhaps I can illustrate that by the detail of the application of machinery to the production of things in which artistic form of some sort is possible. Why does a reasonable man use a machine? Surely to save his labor. There are some things which a machine can do as well as a man's hand plus a tool can do them. He need not, for instance, grind his corn in a hand quern. A little trickle of water, a wheel, and a few simple contrivances will do it all perfectly well, and leave him free to smoke his pipe and think, or to carve the handle of his knife. That, so far, is an unmixed gain in the use of a machine, always, mind you, supposing equality of condition among men. No art is lost. Leisure or time for more pleasurable work is gained. Perhaps a perfectly reasonable and free man would stop there in his dealings with machinery. But such reason and freedom are too much to expect, so let us follow our machine inventor a step farther. He has to weave plain cloth, and finds doing so dullish on the one hand, and on the other that a power loom will weave the cloth nearly as well as a hand loom. So in order to gain more leisure or time for more pleasurable work, he uses a power loom and forgoes the small advantage of the little extra art in the cloth. But so doing, as far as the art is concerned, he has not got a pure gain. He has made a bargain between art and labour, and got a makeshift as a consequence. I do not say that he may not be right in so doing, but that he has lost as well as gained. Now this is as far as a man who values art and is reasonable would go in the matter of machinery, as long as he was free. That is, was not forced to work for another man's profit. So long as he was living in a society that had accepted equality of condition. Carry the machine used for art a step farther, and he becomes an unreasonable man if he values art and is free. To avoid misunderstanding, I must say that I am thinking of the modern machine, which is, as it were, alive, and to which the man is auxiliary, and not of the old machine, the improved tool, which is auxiliary to the man and only works as long as his hand is thinking. Though I will remark that even this elementary form of machine has to be dropped when we come to the higher and more intricate forms of art. Well, as to the machine proper used for art, when it gets to the stage above dealing with a necessary production that has accidentally some beauty about it, a reasonable man with a feeling for art will only use it when he is forced to. If he thinks he would like ornament, for instance, and knows that the machine cannot do it properly, and does not care to spend the time to do it properly, why should he do it at all? He will not diminish his leisure for the sake of making something he does not want, unless some man or band of men force him to it. So he will either go without the ornament, or sacrifice some of his leisure to have it genuine. That will be a sign that he wants it very much, and that it will be worth his trouble. In which case, again, his labour on it will not be mere trouble, but will interest and please him by satisfying the needs of his mood of energy. This, I say, is how a reasonable man would act if he were free from man's compulsion. Not being free, he acts very differently. He has long passed the stage at which machines are only used for doing work repulsive to an average man, or for doing what could be as well done by a machine as a man. And he instinctively expects a machine to be invented whenever any product of industry becomes sought after. He is the slave to machinery. The new machine must be invented, and when invented, he must, I will not say use it, but be used by it, whether he likes it or not. But why is he the slave to machinery? Because he is the slave to the system for whose existence the invention of machinery was necessary. And now I must drop, or rather have dropped, the assumption of the equality of condition, and remind you that, though in a sense we are all the slaves of machinery, yet that some men are so directly, without any metaphor at all, and that these are just those on whom the great body of the arts depends, the workmen. It is necessary for the system which keeps them in their position as an inferior class that they should either be themselves machines or be the servants to machines, in no case having any interest in the work which they turn out. To their employers they are, so far as they are workmen, a part of the machinery of the workshop or the factory. To themselves they are proletarians, human beings working to live that they may live to work. Their part of craftsmen, of makers of things by their own free will, is played out. At the risk of being accused of sentimentality, I will say that since this is so, since the work which produces the things that should be matters of art is but a burden and a slavery, I exult in this at least, that it cannot produce art, that all it can do lies between stark utilitarianism and idiotic sham. Or indeed is that merely sentimental? Rather, I think, we who have learned to see the connection between industrial slavery and the degradation of the arts have learned also to hope for a future for those arts, since the day will certainly come when men will shake off the yoke and refuse to accept the mere artificial compulsion of the gambling market to waste their lives in ceaseless and hopeless toil, and when it does come, their instincts for beauty and imagination set free along with them will produce such art as they need. And who can say that it will not as far surpass the art of past ages as that does the poor relics of it left us by the age of commerce? A word or two on an objection which has often been made to me when I have been talking on this subject. It may be said, and is often, you regret the art of the Middle Ages, as indeed I do, but those who produced it were not free. They were serfs, or guild craftsmen surrounded by brazen walls of trade restrictions. They had no political rights, and were exploited by their masters, the noble caste, most grievously. Well, I quite admit that the oppression and violence of the Middle Ages had its effect on the art of those days. Its shortcomings are traceable to them. They repressed art in certain directions, I do not doubt that. And for that reason I say that when we shake off the present oppression as we shook off the old, we may expect the art of the days of real freedom to rise above that of those old violent days. But I do say that it was possible then to have social, organic, hopeful, progressive art, whereas now such poor scraps of it as are left are the result of individual and wasteful struggle, are retrospective and pessimistic. And this hopeful art was possible amidst all the oppression of those days, because the instruments of that oppression were grossly obvious, and were external to the work of the craftsman. They were laws and customs obviously intended to rob him, and open violence of the highway robbery kind. In short, industrial production was not the instrument used for robbing the lower classes. It is now the main instrument used in that honourable profession. The medieval craftsman was free in his work, therefore he made it as amusing to himself as he could, and it was his pleasure and not his pain that made all things beautiful that were made, and lavished treasures of human hope and thought on everything that man made, from a cathedral to a porridge pot. Come, let us put it in the way least respectful to the medieval craftsman, most polite to the modern hand. The poor devil of the 14th century, his work was of so little value that he was allowed to waste it by the hour in pleasing himself and others. But our highly strung mechanic, his minutes are too rich with the burden of perpetual profit for him to be allowed to waste one of them on art. The present system will not allow him, cannot allow him, to produce works of art. So that there has arisen this strange phenomenon, that there is now a class of ladies and gentlemen, very refined indeed, though not perhaps as well informed as is generally supposed, and of this refined class there are many who do really love beauty and incident, i.e. art, and would make sacrifices to get it. And these are led by artists of great manual skill and high intellect, forming altogether a large body of demand for the article. And yet the supply does not come. Yes, and moreover this great body of enthusiastic demanders are no mere poor and helpless people, ignorant fisher peasants, half-mad monks, scatterbrained sans-culottes. None of those, in short, the expression of whose needs has shaken the world so often before and will do yet again. No, they are of the ruling classes, the masters of men, who can live without labour, and have abundant leisure to scheme out the fulfilment of their desires. And yet I say they cannot have the art which they so much long for, though they hunted about the world so hard, sentimentalizing the sordid lives of the miserable peasants of Italy and the starving proletarians of her towns, now that all the picturesqueness has departed from the poor devils of our own countryside and of our own slums. Indeed, there is little of reality left them anywhere, and that little is fading fast away before the needs of the manufacturer and his ragged regiment of workers, and before the enthusiasm of the archaeological restorer of the dead past. Soon there will be nothing left except the lying dreams of history, the miserable wreckage of our museums and picture galleries, and the carefully guarded interiors of our aesthetic drawing-rooms, unreal and foolish, fitting witnesses of the life of corruption that goes on there, so pinched and meagre and cowardly, with its concealment and ignoring, rather than restraint of, natural longings, which does not forbid the greedy indulgence in them, if it can but be decently hidden. The art, then, is gone, and can no more be restored on its old lines than a medieval building can be. The rich and refined cannot have it, though they would, and though we will believe many of them would. And why? Because those who could give it to the rich are not allowed by the rich to do so. In one word, slavery lies between us and art. I have said as much as that the aim of art was to destroy the curse of labour, by making work the pleasurable satisfaction of our impulse towards energy, and giving to that energy hope of producing something worth its exercise. Now, therefore, I say that, since we cannot have art by striving after its mere superficial manifestation, since we can have nothing but its sham by so doing, there yet remains for us to see how it would be if we let the shadow take care of itself, and try if we can to lay hold of the substance. For my part, I believe that if we try to realize the aims of art without much troubling ourselves what the aspect of the art itself shall be, we shall find we have what we want at last. Whether it is to be called art or not, it will at least be life, and after all that is what we want. It may lead us into new splendours and beauties of visible art, to architecture with manifolded magnificence, free from the curious incompleteness and failings of that which the older times have produced, to painting uniting to the beauty which medieval art attained, the realism which modern art aims at, to sculpture, uniting the beauty of the Greek and the expression of the Renaissance with some third quality yet undiscovered, so as to give us the images of men and women splendidly alive, yet not disqualified from making, as all true sculpture should, architectural ornament. All this it may do. Or, on the other hand, it may lead us into the desert, and art may seem to be dead amidst us, or feebly and uncertainly to be struggling in a world which has utterly forgotten its old glories. For my part, with art as it now is, I cannot bring myself to think that it much matters which of these dooms awaits it, so long as each bears with it some hope of what is to come, since here, as in other matters, there is no hope save in revolution. The old art is no longer fertile, no longer yields us anything save elegantly poetical regrets. Being barren, it has but to die, and the matter of moment now is as to how it shall die, whether with hope or without it. What is it, for instance, that has destroyed the Rouen, the Oxford of my elegant poetic regret? Has it perished for the benefit of the people, either slowly yielding to the growth of intelligent change and new happiness, or has it been, as it were, thunderstricken by the tragedy which mostly accompanies some great new birth? Not so. Neither phalanstère nor dynamite has swept its beauty away. Its destroyers have not been either the philanthropist or the socialist, the cooperator or the anarchist. It has been sold, and at a cheap price indeed, muddled away by the greed and incompetence of fools who do not know what life and pleasure mean, who will neither take them themselves nor let others have them. That is why the death of that beauty wounds us so. No man of sense or feeling would dare to regret such losses if they had been paid for by new life and happiness for the people. But there is the people still as it was before, still facing for its part the monster who destroyed all that beauty, and whose name is commercial profit. I repeat that every scrap of genuine art will fall by the same hands if the matter only goes on long enough, although a sham art may be left in its place which may very well be carried on by dilettanti fine gentlemen and ladies without any help from below. And to speak plainly, I fear that this gibbering ghost of the real thing would satisfy a great many of those who now think themselves lovers of art, though it is not difficult to see a long vista of its degradation till it shall become at last a mere laughing-stock. That is to say, if the thing were to go on. I mean, if art were to be forever the amusement of those whom we now call ladies and gentlemen. But for my part, I do not think it will go on long enough to reach such depths as that. And yet I would be hypocritical if I were to say that I thought that the change in the basis of society, which would enfranchise labour and make men practically equal in condition, would lead us by a short road to the splendid new birth of art which I have mentioned. Though I feel quite certain that it would not leave what we now call art untouched, since the aims of that revolution do include the aims of art, viz., abolishing the curse of labour. I suppose that this is what is likely to happen, that machinery will go on developing with the purpose of saving men labour, till the mass of the people attain real leisure enough to be able to appreciate the pleasure of life, till, in fact, they have attained such mastery over nature that they no longer fear starvation as a penalty for not working more than enough. When they get to that point, they will doubtless turn themselves and begin to find out what it is that they really want to do. They would soon find out that the less work they did, the less work unaccompanied by art, I mean, the more desirable a dwelling place the earth would be. They would accordingly do less and less work, till the mood of energy, of which I began by speaking, urged them on afresh. But by that time nature, relieved by the relaxation of man's work, would be recovering her ancient beauty, and be teaching men the old story of art. And as the artificial famine, caused by men working for the profit of a master, and which we now look upon as a matter of course, would have long disappeared, they would be free to do as they chose, and they would set aside their machines in all cases where the work seemed pleasant or desirable for handiwork, till in all crafts where production of beauty was required, the most direct communication between a man's hand and his brain would be sought for. And there would be many occupations also, as the processes of agriculture, in which the voluntary exercise of energy would be thought so delightful that people would not dream of handing over its pleasure to the jaws of a machine. In short, men will find out that the men of our days were wrong in first multiplying their needs and then trying, each man of them, to evade all participation in the means and processes whereby those needs are satisfied. That this kind of division of labour is really only a new and wilful form of arrogant and slothful ignorance, far more injurious to the happiness and contentment of life than the ignorance of the processes of nature, of what we sometimes call science, which men of the earlier days unwittingly lived in. They will discover, or rediscover rather, that the true secret of happiness lies in the taking a genuine interest in all the details of daily life, in elevating them by art, instead of handing the performance of them over to unregarded drudges and ignoring them, and that in cases where it was impossible, either so to elevate them and make them interesting, or to lighten them by the use of machinery so as to make the labour of them trifling, that should be taken as a token that the supposed advantages gained by them were not worth the trouble and had better be given up. All this, to my mind, would be the outcome of men throwing off the burden of artificial famine, supposing, as I cannot help supposing, that the impulses which have from the first glimmerings of history urged men on to the practice of art were still at work in them. Thus and thus only can come about the new birth of art, and I think it will come about thus. You may say it is a long process, and so it is, but I can conceive of a longer. I have given you the socialist or optimist view of the matter. Now for the pessimist view. I can conceive that the revolt against artificial famine or capitalism, which is now on foot, may be vanquished. The result will be that the working class, the slaves of society, will become more and more degraded, that they will not strive against overwhelming force, but, stimulated by that love of life which nature, always anxious about the perpetuation of the race, has implanted in us, will learn to bear everything. Starvation, overwork, dirt, ignorance, brutality. All these things they will bear as, alas, they bear them too well even now. All this, rather than risk sweet life and bitter livelihood, and all sparks of hope and manliness will die out of them. Nor will their masters be much better off. The earth's surface will be hideous everywhere save in the uninhabitable desert. Art will utterly perish, as in the manual arts, so in literature, which will become, as it is indeed speedily becoming, a mere string of orderly and calculated ineptitudes and passionless ingenuities. Science will grow more and more one-sided, more incomplete, more wordy and useless, till at last she will pile herself up into such a mass of superstition that beside it the theologies of old time will seem mere reason and enlightenment. All will get lower and lower, till the heroic struggles of the past to realize hope from year to year, from century to century, will be utterly forgotten, and man will be an indescribable being, hopeless, desireless, lifeless. And will there be deliverance from this, even? Maybe. Man may, after some terrible cataclysm, learn to strive towards a healthy animalism, may grow from a tolerable animal into a savage, from a savage into a barbarian, and so on. And some thousands of years hence he may be beginning once more those arts which we have now lost, and be carving interlacements like the New Zealanders, or scratching forms of animals on their cleaned blade bones, like the prehistoric men of the drift. But in any case, according to the pessimist view, which looks upon revolt against artificial famine as impossible to succeed, we shall wearily trudge the circle again, until some accident, some unforeseen consequence of arrangement, makes an end of us altogether. That pessimism I do not believe in, nor on the other hand do I suppose that it is altogether a matter of our wills as to whether we shall further human progress or human degradation. Yet, since there are those who are impelled towards the socialist or optimistic side of things, I must conclude that there is some hope of its prevailing, that the strenuous efforts of many individuals imply a force which is thrusting them on. So that I believe that the aims of art will be realized, though I know that they cannot be so long as we groan under the tyranny of artificial famine. Once again I warn you against supposing, you who may specially love art, that you will do any good by attempting to revivify art by dealing with its dead exterior. I say it is the aims of art that you must seek, rather than the art itself. And in that search we may find ourselves in a world blank and bare, as the result of our caring at least this much for art, that we will not endure the shams of it. Anyhow, I ask you to think with me that the worst which can happen to us is to endure tamely the evils that we see, that no trouble or turmoil is so bad as that the necessary destruction which reconstruction bears with it must be taken calmly, that everywhere, in state, in church, in the household, we must be resolute to endure no tyranny, accept no lie, quail before no fear, although they may come before us disguised as piety, duty, or affection, or as useful opportunity and good nature, as prudence or kindness. The world's roughness, falseness, and injustice will bring about their natural consequences, and we and our lives are part of those consequences. But since we inherit also the consequences of old resistance to those curses, let us each look to it to have our fair share of that inheritance also, which if nothing else come of it will at least bring to us courage and hope. That is, eager life while we live, which is above all things the aim of art. End of section 7. Section 8 of Signs of Change by William Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Deborah Brabin. Useful Work versus Useless Toil, Part 1. The above title may strike some of my readers as strange. It is assumed by most people nowadays that all work is useful, and by most well-to-do people that all work is desirable. Most people, well-to-do or not, believe that even when a man is doing work which appears to be useless, he is earning his livelihood by it. He is employed, as the phrase goes. And most of those who are well-to-do cheer on their happy worker with congratulations and praises if he is only industrious enough and deprives himself of all pleasure and holidays in the sacred cause of labour. In short, it has become an article of the creed of modern morality that all labour is good in itself, a convenient belief to those who live on the labour of others. But as to those on whom they live, I recommend them not to take it on trust, but to look into the matter a little deeper. Let us grant first that the race of man must either labour or perish. Nature does not give us our livelihood gratis. We must win it by toil of some sort or degree. Let us see, then, if she does not give us some compensation for this compulsion to labour, since certainly in other matters she takes care to make the acts necessary to the continuance of life in the individual and the race not only endurable but even pleasurable. You may be sure that she does so, that it is of the nature of man, when he is not diseased, to take pleasure in his work under certain conditions. And yet we must say, in the teeth of the hypocritical praise of all labour whatsoever it may be, of which I have made mention, that there is some labour which is so far from being a blessing that it is a curse. That it would be better for the community and for the worker if the latter were to fold his hands and refuse to work, and either die or let us pack him off to the workhouse or prison, which you will. Here, you see, are two kinds of work, one good, the other bad. One not far removed from a blessing, a lightening of life. The other a mere curse, a burden to life. What is the difference between them, then? This: one has hope in it, the other has not. It is manly to do the one kind of work, and manly also to refuse to do the other. What is the nature of the hope which, when it is present in work, makes it worth doing? It is threefold, I think: hope of rest, hope of product, hope of pleasure in the work itself. And hope of these also in some abundance and of good quality. Rest enough and good enough to be worth having, product worth having by one who is neither a fool nor an ascetic, pleasure enough for all of us to be conscious of it while we are at work, not a mere habit, the loss of which we shall feel as a fidgety man feels the loss of the bit of string he fidgets with. I have put the hope of rest first, because it is the simplest and most natural part of our hope. Whatever pleasure there is in some work, there is certainly some pain in all work. The beast-like pain of stirring up our slumbering energies to action, the beast-like dread of change when things are pretty well with us, and the compensation for this animal pain is animal rest. We must feel while we are working that the time will come when we shall not have to work. Also the rest, when it comes, must be long enough to allow us to enjoy it. It must be longer than is merely necessary for us to recover the strength we have expended in working. And it must be animal rest also in this, that it must not be disturbed by anxiety, else we shall not be able to enjoy it. If we have this amount and kind of rest, we shall, so far, be no worse off than the beasts. As to the hope of product, I have said that nature compels us to work for that. It remains for us to look to it that we do really produce something, and not nothing. or at least nothing that we want or are allowed to use. If we look to this and use our wills, we shall so far be better than machines. The hope of pleasure in the work itself. How strange that hope must seem to some of my readers, to most of them. Yet I think that to all living things there is a pleasure in the exercise of their energies, and that even beasts rejoice in being lithe and swift and strong. But a man at work, making something which he feels will exist because he is working at it and wills it, is exercising the energies of his mind and soul as well as of his body. Memory and imagination help him as he works. Not only his own thoughts, but the thoughts of the men of past ages guide his hands, and as a part of the human race he creates. If we work thus, we shall be men, and our days will be happy and eventful. Thus worthy work carries with it the hope of pleasure in rest, the hope of the pleasure in our using what it makes, and the hope of pleasure in our daily creative skill. All other work but this is worthless. It is slaves' work, mere toiling to live that we may live to toil. Therefore, since we have, as it were, a pair of scales in which to weigh the work now done in the world, let us use them. Let us estimate the worthiness of the work we do after so many thousand years of toil, so many promises of hope deferred, such boundless exultation over the progress of civilization and the gain of liberty. Now the first thing as to the work done in civilization, and the easiest to notice, is that it is portioned out very unequally amongst the different classes of society. First, there are people, not a few, who do no work and make no pretense of doing any. Next there are people, and very many of them, who work fairly hard, though with abundant easements and holidays claimed and allowed. And lastly there are people who work so hard that they may be said to do nothing else than work, and are accordingly called the working classes, as distinguished from the middle classes and the rich or aristocracy, whom I have mentioned above. It is clear that this inequality presses heavily upon the working class, and must visibly tend to destroy their hope of rest at least, and so in that particular make them worse off than mere beasts of the field. But that is not the sum and end of our folly in turning useful work into useless toil, but only the beginning of it. For first, as to the class of rich people doing no work, we all know that they consume a great deal while they produce nothing. Therefore, clearly, they have to be kept at the expense of those who do work, just as paupers have, and are a mere burden on the community. In these days there are many who have learned to see this, though they can see no further into the evils of our present system, and have formed no idea of any scheme for getting rid of this burden, though perhaps they have a vague hope that changes in the system of voting for members of the House of Commons may, as if by magic, tend in that direction. Moreover, this class, the aristocracy, once thought most necessary to the state, is scant of numbers and has now no power of its own, but depends on the support of the class next below it, the middle class. In fact, it is really composed either of the most successful men of that class, or of their immediate descendants. As to the middle class, including the trading, manufacturing, and professional people of our society, they do, as a rule, seem to work quite hard enough, and so at first sight might be thought to help the community and not burden it. But by far the greater part of them, though they work, do not produce, and even when they do produce, as in the case of those engaged wastefully indeed in the distribution of goods, or doctors, or genuine artists and literary men, they consume out of all proportion to their due share. The commercial and manufacturing part of them, the most powerful part, spend their lives and energies in fighting amongst themselves for their respective shares of the wealth which they force the genuine workers to provide for them. The others are almost wholly the hangers-on of these. They do not work for the public, but a privileged class. They are the parasites of property. Sometimes, as in the case of lawyers, undisguisedly so, sometimes, as the doctors and others above mentioned, professing to be useful, but too often of no use save as supporters of the system of folly, fraud, and tyranny of which they form a part. And all these, we must remember, have as a rule one aim in view, not the production of utilities, but the gaining of a position either for themselves or their children in which they will not have to work at all. It is their ambition and the end of their whole lives to gain, if not for themselves yet at least for their children, the proud position of being obvious burdens on the community. For their work itself, in spite of the sham dignity with which they surround it, they care nothing, save a few enthusiasts, men of science, art, or letters, who, if they are not the salt of the earth, are at least, and oh the pity of it, the salt of the miserable system of which they are the slaves, which hinders and thwarts them at every turn, and even, sometimes, corrupts them. Here then is another class, this time very numerous and all-powerful, which produces very little and consumes enormously, and is therefore in the main supported, as paupers are, by the real producers. The class that remains to be considered produces all that is produced, and supports both itself and the other classes, though it is placed in a position of inferiority to them. Real inferiority, mind you, involving a degradation both of mind and body. But it is a necessary consequence of this tyranny and folly that again many of these workers are not producers. A vast number of them, once more, are merely parasites of property. Some of them openly so, as the soldiers by land and sea who are kept on foot for the perpetuating of national rivalries and enmities, and for the purposes of the national struggle for the share of the product of unpaid labour. But besides this obvious burden on producers, and the scarcely less obvious one of domestic servants, there is first the army of clerks, shop assistants, and so forth, who are engaged in the service of the private war for wealth, which, as above said, is the real occupation of the well-to-do middle class. This is a larger body of workers than might be supposed, for it includes amongst others all those engaged in what I should call competitive salesmanship, or to use a less dignified word, the puffery of wares, which has now got to such a pitch that there are many things which cost far more to sell than they do to make. Next there is the mass of people employed in making all those articles of folly and luxury, the demand for which is the outcome of the existence of the rich non-producing classes. Things which people leading a manly and uncorrupted life would not ask for or dream of. These things, whoever may gainsay me, I will forever refuse to call wealth. They are not wealth, but waste. Wealth is what nature gives us and what a reasonable man can make out of the gifts of nature for his reasonable use. The sunlight, the fresh air, the unspoiled face of the earth, food, raiment, and housing necessary and decent, the storing up of knowledge of all kinds and the power of disseminating it, means of free communication between man and man. Works of art, the beauty which man creates when he is most a man, most aspiring and thoughtful. All things which serve the pleasure of people, free, manly, and uncorrupted. This is wealth, nor can I think of anything worth having which does not come under one or other of these heads. But think, I beseech you, of the product of England, the workshop of the world. And will you not be bewildered, as I am, at the thought of the mass of things which no sane man could desire, but which our useless toil makes and sells? Now, further, there is even a sadder industry yet, which is forced on many, very many, of our workers. The making of wares which are necessary to them and their brethren, because they are an inferior class. For if many men live without producing, nay, must live lives so empty and foolish that they force a great part of the workers to produce wares which no one needs, not even the rich, it follows that most men must be poor, and living as they do on wages from those whom they support, cannot get for their use the goods which men naturally desire, but must put up with miserable makeshifts for them, with coarse food that does not nourish, with rotten raiment which does not shelter, with wretched houses which may well make a town-dweller in civilization look back with regret to the tent of the nomad tribe or the cave of the prehistoric savage. Nay, the workers must even lend a hand to the great industrial invention of the age, adulteration, and by its help produce for their own use shams and mockeries of the luxuries of the rich. For the wage-earners must always live as the wage-payers bid them, and their very habits of life are forced on them by their masters. But it is a waste of time to try to express in words due contempt of the productions of the much-praised cheapness of our epoch. It must be enough to say that this cheapness is necessary to the system of exploiting on which modern manufacture rests. In other words, our society includes a great mass of slaves, who must be fed, clothed, housed, and amused as slaves, and that their daily necessity compels them to make the slave wares, whose use is the perpetuation of their slavery. To sum up, then, Concerning the manner of work in civilized states, these states are composed of 3 classes. A class which does not even pretend to work, a class which pretends to work but which produces nothing, and a class which works, but is compelled by the other 2 classes to do work which is often unproductive. Civilization therefore wastes its own resources, and will do so as long as the present system lasts. These are cold words with which to describe the tyranny under which we suffer. Try then to consider what they mean. There is a certain amount of natural material and of natural forces in the world, and a certain amount of labour power inherent in the persons of the men that inhabit it. Men, urged by their necessities and desires, have laboured for many thousands of years at the task of subjugating the forces of nature and of making the natural material useful to them. To our eyes, since we cannot see into the future, that struggle with nature seems nearly over, and the victory of the human race over her nearly complete. And looking backwards to the time when history first began, we note that the progress of that victory has been far swifter and more startling within the last 200 years than ever before. Surely, therefore, we moderns ought to be in all ways vastly better off than any who have gone before us. Surely we ought, one and all of us, to be wealthy, to be well furnished with the good things which our victory over nature has won for us. But what is the real fact? Who will dare to deny that the great mass of civilized men are poor? So poor are they that it is mere childishness troubling ourselves to discuss whether perhaps they are in some ways a little better off than their forefathers. They are poor, nor can their poverty be measured by the poverty of a resourceless savage, for he knows of nothing else than his poverty. That he should be cold, hungry, houseless, dirty, ignorant, all that is to him as natural as that he should have a skin. But for us, for the most of us, civilization has bred desires which she forbids us to satisfy, and so is not merely a niggard but a torturer also. Thus then have the fruits of our victory over nature been stolen from us. Thus has compulsion by nature to labour in hope of rest, gain, and pleasure been turned into compulsion by man to labour in hope of living to labour. What shall we do then? Can we mend it? Well, remember once more that it is not our remote ancestors who achieved the victory over nature, but our fathers, nay, our very selves. For us to sit hopeless and helpless, then, would be a strange folly indeed. Be sure that we can amend it. What, then, is the first thing to be done? We have seen that modern society is divided into 2 classes, one of which is privileged to be kept by the labour of the other. That is, it forces the other to work for it, and takes from this inferior class everything that it can take from it, and uses the wealth so taken to keep its own members in a superior position, to make them beings of a higher order than the others, longer-lived, more beautiful, more honoured, more refined than those of the other class. I do not say that it troubles itself about its members being positively long-lived, beautiful, or refined, but merely insists that they shall be so relatively to the inferior class. As also it cannot use the labour power of the inferior class fairly in producing real wealth, it wastes it wholesale in the production of rubbish. It is this robbery and waste on the part of the minority which keeps the majority poor. If it could be shown that it is necessary for the preservation of society that this should be submitted to, little more could be said on the matter, save that the despair of the oppressed majority would probably at some time or other destroy society. But it has been shown, on the contrary, even by such incomplete experiments, for instance, as cooperation, so-called, that the existence of a privileged class is by no means necessary for the production of wealth, but rather for the government of the producers of wealth, or in other words, for the upholding of privilege. The first step to be taken, then, is to abolish a class of men privileged to shirk their duties as men, thus forcing others to do the work which they refuse to do. All must work according to their ability, and so produce what they consume. That is, each man should work as well as he can for his own livelihood, and his livelihood should be assured to him. That is to say, all the advantages which society would provide for each and all of its members. Thus, at last, would true society be founded. It would rest on equality of condition. No man would be tormented for the benefit of another, nay, no one man would be tormented for the benefit of society. nor indeed can that order be called society, which is not upheld for the benefit of every one of its members. But since men live now, that is, they live when so many people do not produce at all and when so much work is wasted, it is clear that, under conditions where all produced and no work was wasted, not only would everyone work with the certain hope of gaining a due share of wealth by his work, but also he could not miss his due share of rest. Here then are 2 out of the 3 kinds of hope mentioned above as an essential part of worthy work, assured to the worker. When class robbery is abolished, every man will reap the fruits of his labour, every man will have due rest. Leisure, that is. Some socialists might say we need not go any further than this. It is enough that the worker should get the full produce of his work, and that his rest should be abundant. But though the compulsion of man's tyranny is thus abolished, I yet demand compensation for the compulsion of nature's necessity. As long as the work is repulsive, it will still be a burden which must be taken up daily, and even so would mar our life, even though the hours of labour were short. What we want to do is add to our wealth, without diminishing our pleasure. Nature will not be finally conquered till our work becomes a part of the pleasure of our lives. That first step of freeing people from the compulsion to labour needlessly will at least put us on the way towards this happy end, for we shall then have time and opportunities for bringing it about. As things are now, between the waste of labour power in mere idleness and its waste in unproductive work, it is clear that the world of civilization is supported by a small part of its people. When all were working usefully for its support, the share of work which each would have to do would be but small. If our standard of life were about on the footing of what well-to-do and refined people now think desirable, we shall have labour power to spare, and shall in short be as wealthy as we please. It will be easy to live. If we were to wake up some morning now under our present system and find it easy to live, that system would force us to set to work at once and make it hard to live. We should call that developing our resources, or some such fine name. The multiplication of labour has become a necessity for us, and as long as that goes on, no ingenuity in the invention of machines will be of any real use to us. Each new machine will cause a certain amount of misery among the workers whose special industry it may disturb. So many of them will be reduced from skilled to unskilled workmen, and then gradually matters will slip into their due grooves, and all will work apparently smoothly again. And if it were not that all this is preparing revolution, things would be for the greater part of men just as they were before the new wonderful invention. But when revolution has made it easy to live, when all are working harmoniously together, and there is no one to rob the worker of his time, that is to say, his life, in those coming days there will be no compulsion on us to go on producing things we do not want, no compulsion on us to labour for nothing. We shall be able calmly and thoughtfully to consider what we shall do with our wealth of labour power. Now for my part I think the first use we ought to make of that wealth, of that freedom, should be to make all our labour, even the commonest and most necessary, pleasant to everybody. For thinking over the matter carefully, I can see that the one course which will certainly make life happy in the face of all accidents and troubles is to take a pleasurable interest in all the details of life. And lest perchance you think that an assertion too universally accepted to be worth making, let me remind you how entirely modern civilization forbids it. With what sordid and even terrible details it surrounds the life of the poor, what a mechanical and empty life she forces on the rich, and how rare a holiday it is for any of us to feel ourselves a part of nature, and unhurriedly, thoughtfully and happily to note the course of our lives amidst all the little links of events which connect them with the lives of others, and build up the great whole of humanity. But such a holiday our whole lives might be, if we were resolute to make all our labour reasonable and pleasant. But we must be resolute indeed, for no half measures will help us here. It has been said already that our present joyless labour, and our lives, scared and anxious as the life of a hunted beast, are forced upon us by the present system of producing for the profit of the privileged classes. It is necessary to state what this means. Under the present system of wages and capital, the manufacturer, most absurdly so called, since a manufacturer means a person who makes with his hands, having a monopoly of the means whereby the power to labour inherent in every man's body can be used for production, is the master of those who are not so privileged. He and he alone is able to make use of this labour power, which, on the other hand, is the only commodity by means of which his capital, that is to say the accumulated product of past labour, can be made productive to him. He therefore buys the labour power of those who are bare of capital and can only live by selling it to him. His purpose in this transaction is to increase his capital, to make it breed. It is clear that if he paid those with whom he makes his bargain the full value of their labour, that is to say, all that they produced, he would fail in his purpose. But since he is the monopolist of the means of productive labour, he can compel them to make a bargain better for him and worse for them than that. Which bargain is that after they have earned their livelihood, estimated according to a standard high enough to ensure their peaceable submission to his mastership, the rest, and by far the larger part as a matter of fact, of what they produce, shall belong to him, shall be his property to do as he likes with, to use or abuse at his pleasure. Which property is, as we all know, jealously guarded by army and navy, police and prison. In short, by that huge mass of physical force which superstition, habit, fear of death by starvation, ignorance, in one word, among the propertyless masses, enables the propertied classes to use for the subjection of their slaves. Now at other times, other evils resulting from this system may be put forward. What I want to point out now is the impossibility of our attaining to attractive labour under this system, and to repeat that it is this robbery, there is no other word for it, which wastes the available labour power of the civilized world, forcing many men to do nothing, and many, very many more, to do nothing useful, and forcing those who carry on really useful labour to most burdensome overwork. For understand once for all that the manufacturer aims primarily at producing, by means of the labour he has stolen from others, not goods, but profits, that is, the wealth that is produced over and above the livelihood of his workmen and the wear and tear of his machinery. Whether that wealth is real or sham means nothing to him. If it sells and yields him a profit, it is all right. I have said that, owing to there being rich people who have more money than they can spend reasonably, and who therefore buy sham wealth, there is waste on that side. And also that, owing to there being poor people who cannot afford to buy things which are worth making, there is waste on that side. So that the demand which the capitalist supplies is a false demand. The market in which he sells is rigged by the miserable inequalities produced by the robbery of the system of capital and wages. End of section 8.